This is Hot Science with the week's top news in science, technology, and medicine. I'm Richard Clarke, and I'll be your host. And welcome, everybody. Let me give you a review of the top stories, then we'll dive into it. The top news is top scientists say that we're in deep, deep trouble. This is an article just for Andrew. And then in technology, Mexico makes a lot of electric cars, but few Mexicans drive them. And I know one of our participants, Norman, is one of those that does drive them. So we'll be able to have somebody commenting that has some real experience. And in environment, the global freshwater demand will outstrip supply by 40% in 2030. That's pretty soon, say the experts. And in flight, the Air Force lays out its plans for NGAD, Next Generation Fighter, which includes the loyal wingman. And this is a whole new concept in air-to-air warfare and is real interesting. And in biology, big oil firms have touted algae as their climate solution, and now all of them have pulled the funding for this project. And the human story is the world population bomb may never go off as feared, finds a new story that uses a new methodology. And in medicine, Alzheimer's first signs may appear in your eyes, finds a new study. So let's get on with the stories. Top scientists say that we're in deep trouble. It's not over just yet, says the UN's climate watchdog, but things are looking very, very bad. This is per the latest IPCC report from the UN. The UN Secretary General says, quote, humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast. Our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once. This is the most extreme call to action that I've heard from the UN. And the UN is calling specifically on richer countries to accelerate their plans for net zero emissions by about 10 years, saying that richer countries should aim for net zero by 2040 and development countries try to get there by 2050. At the same time, they acknowledge that at the current levels of mitigation and adaptation policy, those targets likely won't be met. Another UN target that won't be met, they have set for coal, for rich countries to stop using coal by 2030 and poorer ones to do by 2040. Now, the IPCC chair, Husung Lee, said that we're at a critical moment in history. The choices we make now and in the next few years will reverberate around the world for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. And that's a pretty scary thought. Comments from you guys?
I think the most cost-effective way to improve environment is to assist lower income countries where a little expense could uh, yield much greater results than large expenses in the developed world.
I'm sure there's a lot of truth in that. I
Yeah,
think
they
they
say
call it the low-hanging fruit. I'm sorry,
well,
go ahead.
they say too, as people become wealthier, they take more of an interest in the environment and their surroundings and less interest in actual survival. But
Mm-hmm.
this is just another example of clickbait nonsense. The IPCC have been forecasting catastrophe for the last 30 years, and it's never happened. And the the reality is that all the politicians and decision makers know this, and they know that the IPCC is just um, forecasts, computer models, and things like that. And if the decision makers were taking it seriously, they'd be doing something about it. But they're not doing anything about it. And that just shows they know that it's nonsense. So everything will continue the way it is. If people really want to find out about the IPCC, they should read Dr. Stephen Koonen's book, Unsettled, where he shows repeatedly that the IPCC officials ignore the detailed findings of their scientists and put um, misrepresentations in their summaries for decision makers. So
I guess that would put you in the category of a denier.
well, people use the word denier in a pejorative sense.
Well, that
And
certainly
that's,
was my intent.
well, that's really not entirely fair. But the
But
reality is,
but saying blaming it on blind officials when the officials are getting tremendous amount of support, financial and otherwise, from the oil and petrochemical business, which is making the most profits ever, uh, seems to me to be maybe you're overlooking that part of it because these people are politicians and they need money to be able to run, and the most money is available now from the fossil fuel industry.
well, the
Well,
reality is,
there is another point. The world, the globe, has gone through climate change continuously. And while we are mistreating the environment, how much of that impacts climate change is unclear to me.
Anyway, it's clear to a lot of the climate scientists. I went through something with Andrew with the major British Geological Society, which is a pretty conservative group of scientists, and they certainly have a long view of the history of the climate. And even they have concluded that, yeah, climate changes all the time, but the stuff that we're having going on now is caused by humans.
well, there's certainly some of it that's human caused. But if the
Mm-hmm.
climate change activists were genuinely concerned about carbon reduction, there'd be they'd be pounding the pulpits for nuclear power and energy conservation and improved energy efficiency. But instead, they're pounding the pulpits for alternative electricity and other environmentally harmful choices. So you really got to wonder, is it ignorance on the part of the environmental activists, or do they have some ulterior
or do they know
agenda?
something or think something that you don't think? Because the fact that the newspapers ignore the environmental activity that is going on means that the picture that we get of the protests is still diminished. Anyway, so there are lots of people who think it's a problem. You don't think it's a problem. We've had more environmental crisis in the last year, for example, with heat around the planet, that I think there's plenty of evidence, but we can all write the evidence off. Well, it was just a bad year. Except it's been lots of bad years, one after another, and more on the way, is what I believe the evidence shows. Anyway,
other evidence is that it's very hard to bring up renewables, and bringing up nuclear and hydro is much faster and more effective.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's just see what you say in a few years, because we're in the middle of a big shift in the world's energy production, and things are going to be very different at the end of this decade, I believe, because of that.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and at the end of the decade, by the way, is pretty fast.
That's why it's such nonsense to predict such catastrophe in such a short period of time. We all have been around for 20 years, and we know the IPCC have been predicting catastrophe within the decade for the last 20 years, and it just doesn't happen.
But there are other experts. There are other experts that say that this is happening also. It's not just them.
Right.
And I carried around a sign for a walk, a protest walk, that said, if 90%, 97% of your doctors said you were having a heart attack, would you believe the other 3%? No. And the same is true with climate change. 97% of climate scientists say we have a problem. The other 3%, I'm hearing from you, Andrew.
No, that's wrong that 97% say that we're on the edge of catastrophe. All you got to do...
That's what the 3% say.
No, 90% of them say that it's uncertain. And all you got to do is read Steve Koonen's book, and he shows right from the IPCC studies and background that it's misrepresented in the summaries.
Anyway, let me move on. I don't think we're going to settle this at the moment. Now, in Mexico, soon will become a hub of EV production, but the zero-emission cars remain too expensive for most Mexicans, and they are impractical to drive in much of the country, which lacks charging stations. The border state of Nuevo Leon is going to have General Motors, Ford, BMW, Volkswagen's auto units producing EVs, besides Tesla, of course, and then Mexico's own EV maker, Zacua. And the Mexican government says it wants EVs to amount to half of all cars sold domestically by 2030. EVs sales now make up just 0.5% of the domestic auto sales. If you add hybrids, Mexico reaches 4.7%. I think the lack of chargers makes the hybrid more popular in Mexico. And there still are a number of issues that need resolving. One of them is a lack of subsidies for buyers. Another is high cost for installing chargers at home, and then a shortage of public charging stations. And the chief executive of EV maker Zakua says, quote, I have my reservations that we can reach authorities' expectations by 2030. A real and government incentive scheme would be necessary to really accelerate adoption of EVs. And on the price side, you can see the problem. Tesla's cheapest model costs about $55,000 plus the expense of a charger. The Nissan Leaf goes for about $50,000, and even the two-seater Mexican Zacua costs a little more than $30,000, and that's the lowest cost alternative made in Mexico. The typical Mexican worker makes on the average $366 a month. So the lowest price car is about 100 months of their income. So this is just doesn't work for Mexico yet. But, still we have some people like Norman who have been able to, use EVs and has been very happy with EVs. And he's so happy that he bought his wife a second one.
Yeah. Now we have to remember the average price of a new car in the United States is now $48,000.
Uh-huh.
And the EV charging network in Mexico is not perfect. The supercharger network for Teslas only is quite good. And if you live in Mexico City, having an EV is very attractive because you can drive it every day, even during smog conditions. Whereas otherwise, you can only drive it alternate days. And Mexico City now has electrified all of Line 3 bus line. And buses and delivery vehicles, of course, contribute much more pollution than personal cars that are used an hour a day or whatever.
Mm-hmm. How much did it cost you to install your charger?
Maybe $100.
Okay.
I mean, it's just a
that's
50
sure not
amp,
much. Okay.
50 amp HEMA 220 socket.
Okay. Now, is the availability to put a 50 amp socket, is that something that is commonly available in the usual Mexican house? Or would they have to upgrade their power?
I don't know. 220 is quite common here.
Well, 220 is common. 50 amps is still a lot of amps.
Well, no, you can only charge, at least with the Tesla mobile adapter, at 32 amps an hour.
Okay.
No, but what Richard means is the average service to a house in Mexico is probably only 50 amps. In the old days, it used to be 100 amps in the US, but now they're increasing it to 200 amps in new developments.
Okay.
But really what Mexico is representative of most of the world. People don't have the money to buy these expensive EVs unless they're subsidized by the government.
Right. I think that's why Indonesia is subsidizing a local manufacturer of electric bikes.
Yeah, and that makes a lot more sense certainly closer to the equator if they put everyone on an electric bike.
Right. Well, I sure remember from India, and there it seems like the average transportation for a family that was doing well was their motorbike, and they could get 4 people on the motorbike just fine.
Yeah,
and Mexico, rather than subsidizing EVs, is subsidizing gasoline.
Right. Yep, that was also commented on the article that Mexico is kind of pushing the other end. So I think you're right also, Andrew, because when you're talking about Mexico, you're talking about the situation in much of the rest of the world. And Mexico is doing better financially than a lot of the countries in the rest of the world. So what is the Mexico economy in the world now? Norman, something like number 7 or number 10 or something like that. They're in the top group of countries.
All we can be absolutely sure of is the Mexican peso is increasing in value astronomically.
Oh, I know. Every time I convert my U.S. Social Security to Mexican pesos, it hurts. So I've had about a 10% income drop in the last few months.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now on to the next environmental story. I'm sorry, this is a problem too. And the world, they're saying, is facing also an imminent water crisis, with demand expected to outstrip supply of fresh water by 40% at the end of the decade. This is a new study that was done prior to the first UN meeting on water issues. And what these people are saying is governments must urgently stop subsidizing the extraction and overuse of water through misdirected agricultural subsidies, like you see in California with the water for the Central Valley. And industries must be made to overhaul their wasteful practices. And what they say next is it might be true, but I think this is going to be difficult, that nations must start to manage water as a global common good, because it turns out most countries are highly dependent upon their neighbors for their water supply. And the world's neglect of water resources looks like it's leading to a disaster. And so these guys are saying we need a more proactive and ambitious common good approach. And this report marks the first time the global water system has been scrutinized comprehensively. And it really looks like a problem. They say most governments don't realize how interdependent they are when it comes to water. Most countries depend for about half of their water supply on evaporation of water from neighboring countries. This is known as green water because it's the water that's held in soil and then expelled by the forests and ecosystems when the plants take water from the soil and release water vapor into the air. And the report has several key recommendations that I'll get to in a minute. They say water is fundamental to the climate crisis and the global food issue, and that many of the ways in which we use our water are inefficient and in need of change. And they say particularly if you look at the developed countries' sewage systems, we're really cheating ourselves in terms of this linear, waterborne, modern system dealing with waste. There are massive innovations required. And so the 7 calls to action on water. First is to manage the global water cycle as a global common good. And again, I think that is tough. We're mainly not very good at looking at things globally. Then ensure safe and adequate water for every vulnerable group and work with industry to scale up investment in water. The third is to stop underpricing water. Water is heavily subsidized, and that's one of the ways, for example, the government subsidize farmers is by giving them water below cost. And then number 4 is to reduce the more than $700 billion a year in subsidies for agriculture and water every year. So water is heavily subsidized by governments around the world. Almost that's 2/3 of $1 trillion. You know, you add it up and it gets to be real money. And then establish just water partnership to mobilize finance for low and middle income countries. I think that's going to be tough because where they have to get the money to do that is from the rich countries, and the rich countries don't much like giving their money away. And then take urgent action this decade on issues like restoring wetlands and depleting groundwater resources, recycling the water that's used in industry, moving to precision agriculture that uses water more efficiently. And the 7th is reform the governance of water as an international level, and includes water trade agreements. So that's a pretty ambitious set of goals, and they're goals that require a lot of cooperation around the world. And for me, I don't see that kind of cooperation around the world happening yet. What about you guys? Is water an issue where you live?
It's not an issue where here in Canada, we got tons of water. But if this is correct, and we're going to be 40% short of water in just 7 years, that's a far more significant problem than climate change. And you wonder why we're not paying more attention to it if indeed this is true. I think the headline is alarmist clickbait. We're not going to be 40% short in just 7 years because so much of our water wastage is discretionary, and it could be reduced just by throttling the supply to people like lettuce growers in the Imperial Valley in California. But maybe this is the new global catastrophe that the alarmists are going to have us rally around.
Now, one of the things it didn't say is what is our present level of global water shortage. And I would think if we're going to have a 40% shortage of water in 7 years, that we already have some of that now.
Maybe we're 39% short right now.
Could be. And
but Israel is self-sufficient in water to the degree that they're in a position to export water now, and they do well in agriculture, but conserving water, not like we use in the Central Valley of California.
Yeah, Israel's kind of a Garden of Eden. They're in the middle of the desert with their
And Israel also is a rich country.
Why is it rich? It's not all subsidies from the U.S. They must generate money somehow.
They have an economy. They have technology. They make stuff and sell stuff. Some of the best spy systems that are available in today's technology are Israelis. So anyway, so Israel is one of the technical hubs, and it's probably the biggest technical hub in the Middle East.
So the real question, though, is do you think this water shortage is going to achieve the same importance that climate change has in the media?
Maybe not in the media, but I read a forecast more than 10 years ago that the next wars would be fought not over petroleum, but over water.
Yeah, and one of the things we don't see is the lowering of aquifers. Like this underground water volumes are down about 40% of what they were 100 years ago because of over pumping for irrigation and whatever.
Well, when I was in San Jose, the water table in San Jose last century went from 10 feet to 300 feet. It turns out when I was in this little town in South India, the water table also in the last 100 years went from 10 feet to 300 feet.
So maybe this is the issue that the environmentalists should be elevating, not climate change.
Well, I don't know if we can do it just one because we have multiple things going on.
But low flush toilets aren't going to solve the water problem.
No.
Agricultural water, minor improvements would save tremendous amounts of water.
Right. One of the things that, some have been doing agriculturally now some have been doing it for 30 years is this no-till agriculture. And one of the things of no-till agriculture is it drastically reduces the water needed.
Vertical farming, rather than using the earth, is much more conservative of water and is forthcoming.
Mm-hmm. So to me, it's another one of the issues that is a resource issue. And certainly you can argue that since the Industrial Revolution, we have not been doing a good job of conserving our resources. We have the view that the resources are there to be exploited, and we're the ones to exploit them.
And I'm not sure of the numbers, but agriculture uses a lot of water. For every pound of food they generate, it takes hundreds of pounds of water. And similarly, beef cattle, for every pound of beef you wind up with, it takes hundreds of pounds of water to get there. So we don't know the full dimensions of this issue. But isn't it interesting too? Now they're talking about these meteorological rivers of water in the sky, and we never even heard of that 10 years ago. This is a new problem that
I think it's not a new problem. We just have better ability to monitor and measure what's going on.
Yeah, like all these problems in Northern California. Now they got way more water than they know what to do with.
But I've lived in California for a lot of years, and sometimes it was wet and sometimes it wasn't.
Sorry, in Somalia, tens of millions of people are dying because of the drought.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things also that concerns me about this is if we're going to see as many as projected the movements of hundreds of millions of people because of climate issues, then I bet water for supplies for these moving people is also a problem. Anyway, we live in rich, wet areas. I just have to look outside my door and see Lake Chapala, and it looks wet.
Yeah,
but at the same time, the extraction of groundwater for the berry farms is dropping the level of not only of the water table, but of the land
Right.
in areas of this intense berry farming that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Anyway, just another one of the things that might be a worry. Now, the next story I think is real interesting, and it's an Air Force story. The Air Force has laid out its plan for the next batch of next generation air defense, that's NGAD systems, and it's going to consist of 200 manned fighters and 1,000 high performance drones that will accompany them. And this is going to be 2 drones for each of the manned 6th generation fighters, and then 2 drones to accompany about 300 F-35s that are also being considered in the plan. And let me show you these things. So here we have one of the fighters being refueled. And here we have one of these next generation fighters. These are actually the 2nd generation of U.S. stealth fighters. And if you look at them, they have done an enormous amount of work to not have anything hanging off of them. For example, their weapons packets are enclosed within the frame, and when they have to fire missiles, they open up and fire them and then close back up to reduce the drag. And here is the coolest thing. These are a part of the system. These are the drone, and common language, these are known as the loyal wingman. And there will be 2 of these with each of the fighters, and they'll be controlled by the fighter pilot. And the Air Force thinks of these unmanned aircraft as collaborative combat aircraft, and they'll have similar flight characteristics as the manned fighter aircraft and are expected to accompany them into battle. And this is going to make a new kind of air warfare. Now, the idea of these loyal wingmen has been in the works for a long time. The most prominent program to develop them is Project Skyborg, which is one of the major priority defense projects, and Cyborg is a sprawling effort to develop software, hardware, user interfaces, and other details of a future collaborative combat air force system, and that will be employed alongside manned jets. And the Air Force sees this next generation fighter jet as a system of systems, a collection of manned and unmanned assets that can act as one unit. There are 3 high-performance drones that are currently in test, and the U.S. is not the only country doing this. For example, Airbus is in the process of developing their own 6th-generation fighter jets with their own loyal wingman drones. I haven't heard of any of this for the Russians or Chinese. So far, we don't see developments in countries we would think of as adversaries. But it seems like real cool Air Force stuff. And I'm really surprised to see how advanced they are in trying to implement this drone technology to supplement our fighter jets.
I have 2 observations. First off, we seem not to be able to defend ourselves against intercontinental ballistic missiles. And secondly, the warfare in Ukraine has not depended on control of the airspace. Fighters, Russians aren't using fighters, and the Ukrainians to date haven't been. Everything has been drones and missiles. Few hypersonic missiles or intercontinental ballistic missiles. But those seem to be more the warfare tools now.
Generally, they say for a successful invasion, you need to first have control of the airspace. And you wonder why we hear so little about the airspace over the Ukraine. Do the Russians have control of it? Or
no, they don't. And that surprised me from the very beginning. And I don't know what all the problems are with the Russian Air Force. I know one of the problems the Russians have is they're not very good at using combined arms. That's using the tools of the different services to fight together. I also know early on the U.S. gave Ukraine a kind of air defense system that identifies radar sources and takes the radar sources out. And one of the reasons why the Russian air fight has been limited is the fighters depend on these radars to be able to do their job. And if you can't turn your ground radar on because it's going to be destroyed, then that limits the fighters. Now, I still suspect that the battle in Russia is not a real sign of what they call near-peer warfare, because Russia has not shown themselves to be at all equal to the U.S. or NATO forces. So I would wonder what China is doing, actually. And we know China is working on those supersonic missiles. Hypersonic, I guess they are. They have those. Anyway, to me, it's just interesting, and it's a different part of the problem. And it seems like we're in a near-peer contest. This sure seems like it would be a powerful system.
Well, instead of calling them loyal wingmen, they should be calling them disposable wingmen.
Oh, that's absolutely part of the deal. They're a lot lower in cost, and the way they figure they will use them is the actual the heart of the attacks that go on will be done by the loyal wingman. So if you have something shot out of the air, it's going to be a wingman and not the expensive jet.
Or expensive pilot.
Right. Or very expensive pilot. Yes. Okay.
The
Go
other
ahead.
thing, that point about all the armament on those new jets being internal, it's not so much to reduce the drag as it is to reduce the radar signature of
Right.
the airplane.
Right. You're right about that. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry you're right. I'm just sorry I misstated it. I like your being right. That's why I love doing these things. Okay. Next, we have another story. I have it as a biological story. It could have been an environmental story. It's certainly an energy story. And one by one, the big oil firms have touted their investment in algae biofuels as the future of low carbon transportation. And then, one by one, they all have dropped out. The last remaining algae proponent was ExxonMobil, and it now has announced its withdrawal. And algae research was central to Exxon's green marketing campaign for years and was frequently criticized as greenwashing rather than a genuine research effort. And whether it was greenwashing or not, Exxon had invested $350 million in algae biofuels. And the algae researchers who spoke to The Guardian, the source of this article, had said that they had felt there was a real effort to commercialize biofuels, but to do it is going to require several $billion and a long-term dedication to overcoming what seem like fundamental biological limitations on wild organisms, and no oil company so far has been willing to go that far. It's very challenging and very expensive to bring these technology to market, and the oil firms are driven by Wall Street looking for short-term returns rather than long-term investments. One of the biggest challenges to using wild strains of algae is they didn't deliver high enough levels of the lipids, the fats that were needed to produce large quantities of fuel. And there's one company, Veridas, was focused on genetically modifying algae to maximize lipid production. They were making real progress. They figured to be commercially effective, the strain needed to produce 15 grams of oil per square meter, and Veridas strain had achieved 10, so they were making progress. But now with Exxon out of it, their main funder is out of it, they've laid off 60% of their staff. And now the researchers say algae biofuels at the scale necessary is now, they say, at least a decade and maybe 2 decades away. What was needed to make algae fuel a success was a long-term viewpoint and funding in the billions. No oil company was ready to do that. That's close to what they're spending now on fossil fuels, and they weren't willing to make that kind of investment yet. It's too big a change, too expensive, too hard to do. And they can make lots of money now selling oil.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and private industry needs predictability before they'll invest huge quantities of shareholder money. Mm-hmm. And right now, the predictability of biofuels is too uncertain and too far in the future. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's not getting attention. But it makes me wonder, maybe one of the reasons the environmentalists are attacking the fossil fuel industry is that it's largely private, where if the water industry is largely public money, government run. So the environmentalists know they can't pull down capitalism by attacking the government. So they attack the fossil fuel industry. Is that possible? Why, really, the water issue is probably more critical than the climate change issue.
But the biggest of the oil companies, Aramco, you can say it's a private company, but it is so closely integrated with the Saudi government that I think that's just a fiction.
Yeah, it acts like a private company, don't you think? Just run by the government.
Well, sure, they seem to be like making money. And what did they make last year? $350 billion or something? They made more in profits than the gross national product of countries like Greece in their total economy. So that's pretty good. Okay, now continuing along, this is what was talked about a problem, but it may not be as bad as they thought. And there has long been a fear of a population bomb, with populations getting above 9 billion and continuing to grow. And now this new report says that human numbers are going to peak lower and sooner than previously forecast. This report projects that based on current trends, the world population will reach a high of 8.8 billion before the middle of the century. It's 2046 is the forecast, and then decline rapidly. And these new forecasts are good news for the global environment, because fewer people means fewer environmental problems and less strain on the environment. Their authors caution, though, that falling birth rates alone will not solve the planet's environmental problem, because the problems are mainly caused by the excess consumption of a wealthy minority. I think actually we're considered part of that wealthy minority. And so declining populations, as we've talked about here, also create new problems like a shrinking workforce and a greater stress on healthcare associated with an aging society. You see this already in places like Japan and South Korea, and we're going to see this in many other places before the end of the century. Now, just last year, the UN estimated that the world population would hit 9.7 billion by the middle of the century and continue to rise for several decades afterward. So this is a real different view of the population of the world. And this view is based on a new methodology which incorporates social and economic factors that have already had a proven impact on birth rate, such as rising education levels, especially for women, and improving income. So in terms of population, this report looks a lot more promising. We already are at 8 billion, so maybe the population only grows another 10% and then starts to taper off.
One of the things is the population bomb was originally populated or popularized by Paul Ehrlich in the 1960s. And he, along with the Club of Rome, had their predictions of collapse and disaster that never came true. And they've been largely discredited. The Club of Rome is a non-functioning, non-issue now. So I wouldn't put much stock in any of their predictions. But the mention of the aging demographic is probably a reality that is going to make a huge change. That, and we'll all run out of water. But
well, again, the aging demographics, we see a leading example of that is Japan. And it seems like 20 years ago, that problem started to take the energy out of the Japanese economy. Because I certainly remember 30 and 40 years ago, America's fear in their economy was how fast Japan was improving over America. But that's gone away as an issue. And I think the population crunch was a big part of it.
And the same thing's happening in China now as well. And they say China isn't the threat that they thought it was even 5 years ago because of this aging demographic.
Right. One of the places I really wonder is South Korea. Their birth rate now, 2.1 is about steady state population. Their birth rate is 0.8. And maybe they need to be invaded by North Korea so they can get more people. I don't know.
Well, you wonder if the North Koreans and the South Koreans will get together like the East Germans and the Germans.
It's hard to imagine.
It's not, but who would have imagined in 1985 that the Soviets would collapse or East Germany would...
Anyway, we'll see it as a problem when Germany is one of the countries that is forecast to have this population crash, and we will see the impact of that before the end of the century. So anyway, it's a different era, and to me, these new predictions kind of fit more with what I understand is going on. So we're doing something that'll reduce the pressure on the planet.
And you wonder, how will these changes come about? Like, will we first see a collapse of the social programs that are financed by successful growing economies?
We really see that issue in France, don't we?
Well, yeah, they are revolting because they're going to have to work for another 2 years until they're 64.
And that's right. France has the lowest retirement age in Europe, it looks like.
But the real issue on population growth now is the growth in Africa. Because it's true, while much of the world, the population is declining, that's not true in Africa.
Right.
No, and it's a young population too. And so in another 50 years, the world is going to be dominated by young Africans, or the population numbers are going to be dominated by young Africans.
And one of the places that has gone through the kind of transition you're talking about, Africa, is India, because India in the last 20 years has grown tremendously and has been dealing with the problem of how do you prepare for the future when you're growing your population so fast? And India, though it's a poor country, still has had the money to build hundreds of colleges and stuff like this. The problem they have building all the colleges is, where do you find the college professors? Because it's easier to build buildings than it is to find a good professor.
Same with hospitals. They can't staff the hospitals we've got, let alone new ones. Yeah.
Okay, last story for today. It's in your eyes. The eyes, they say, are more than a window to your soul. They're also a reflection of your cognitive health. Here, the director of medical education in Boca Raton says the eye is the window into the brain. You can see directly into the nervous system by looking into the back of the eye towards the optic nerve and retina. And they say that one day doctors may be able to use eye tests to identify cognitive decline soon after it begins. Researchers have been exploring how the eye may help diagnosing Alzheimer's before symptoms begin. And by the time now you can see it in memory and behavior, the disease is already well advanced, and Alzheimer's begins decades before the first symptoms of memory loss. And so if doctors are able to identify the disease in its earliest stages, people could make the healthy lifestyle choices and control their modifiable risk factors like high blood pressure and high cholesterol and diabetes. And what they found when they looked at it is they see changes in the retina that are correlated with changes in the brain. And the study concluded that the study collected retinal and brain tissue samples over 14 years from 86 human donors with Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment. And what they found was significant increases in beta amyloid, which is a key marker for Alzheimer's, in both groups, the Alzheimer's and early cognitive design. And they also found markers for inflammation, which may be an important marker for disease progression. So they say tissue atrophy and inflammation in cells in the far periphery of the retina were the most predictive of cognitive status. So these findings may lead to the development of imaging techniques that let us diagnose Alzheimer's disease earlier and more accurately. These kind of changes, of course, this is going to be a decade before we see anything from this, I bet, but at least it's hopeful.
Well, it's amazing how much the medical system of diagnosis and treatment has improved just in the last 25 years.
Yes.
And so many things that would have killed us 25 years ago can now be identified and managed.
Right.
So we're now, more and more of us are living long enough to die of old age.
Mm-hmm.
And
more of us are living long enough to have our mind go away with Alzheimer's.
Yeah. So is that good or bad? I don't know.
Well, it depends.
But I notice here at the bottom of your list, Richard, you say, if you no longer want to get this newsletter, ask to be removed. what I'm wondering is how many people are on your distribution list for this listing of the Zoom topics?
It's more than 200.
Well, I think you should add a little bit right at the front saying you're doing a survey and you're sending it out to 200 people, but only 3 or 4 show up for the Zoom meeting, and ask them, should we be talking about different things, or should be we what would they like to see differently?
Well, that's a good
Richard,
thought.
how many YouTube views are you getting for Hot Science?
I'm getting 50 to 100 a week.
That's pretty good.
So
do you think those are the same people who are getting the distribution of the mail out?
Well, I send it to the mail out, but most of the YouTube views, according to the stats that I see, are from YouTube features, not people who are clicking on a link to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things actually I've been doing with the help of ChatGPT is improving how compelling the description is for the YouTube video. So
you could ask ChatGPT to formulate a survey that
certainly, and I could. There's our free survey tools where I can send up that survey. I did one a while back and got a few answers, but most people are non-responders.
These things are interesting topics. I kind of wonder why more people aren't hooking in.
Me too. That's a good question. So I do from the newsletters. There are responses I get every week from people saying how much they enjoy the newsletter and reading through the articles. So I know there are people out there that appreciate them and use them and read through this stuff carefully. It's not just you, Andrew. There are more.
Well, maybe they think they get enough out of reading the articles. They don't have to listen to the opinions.
That's right. Maybe. Anyway, I don't know. It's a good thought. I'll think about it and try to do something, and I know how to do it anyway. Anyway, good idea.
Great. Well, thanks again for
Richard.
You're certainly welcome. I appreciate it, and certainly I know as long as we have you and Norman participating, then we're going to have thoughtful commentary, and that's great.
Well, I think we cover both sides of a lot of issues.
Yes. Anyway, see you next time, and thank you for joining us. Adios.
Bye-bye.